Pat Nixon was very much the helpmate, the quiet wife.
I think she's somebody, Pat came out of a place of great struggle and made something of her life on her own by her own determination.
She was born Thelma Catherine Ryan on March 16, 1912. She lost both parents during her childhood and worked long hours on their farm in California.
She worked her early years probably harder than any First Lady and put herself and her two brothers through college, graduating cum laude.
While working as a teacher in Whittier, California, Pat met a recent Duke Law graduate named Richard Nixon.
He was obviously smitten, so smitten, in fact, that he would pick her up, take her to dates that she had with other men, and then drive her home. After about a year, when he asked her to marry him, she said yes.
They were married in Riverside, California in 1940. 6 years later, Richard Nixon made a run for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives.
I don't think Pat Nixon had any real interest in politics. I don't think she cared about it that much.
On the other hand, because of the strong work ethic, she could do politics. Just some hours after her first child, Patricia, was born, she was out doing campaign things.
And finally, Senator Nixon of California is elected by the delegates as their nominee for vice president.
After serving 2 terms as vice president, Richard Nixon made a run at the presidency in 1960. It was a close race that he lost to John F. Kennedy. But in 1968, Richard Nixon returned and scored a presidential victory over Hubert Humphrey. The Nixons moved into the White House the following January.
Mrs. Nixon always had her own schedule when she traveled abroad as First Lady. She was the most well-traveled wife, at least up to that point, of a president.
She went to Liberia, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast. But whereas Jackie Kennedy had kind of gone sometimes and been this sort of dazzling person, Pat Nixon very strongly took on the costumes and the culture of the places she went.
Pat Nixon's efforts within the White House were equally popular to the public.
She made the House as accessible to as wide a diversity of people as possible. She instituted evening tours. She instituted tours of the gardens and the grounds. She even had brochures made in foreign languages so people who didn't speak English could guide themselves through the rooms. And at night, she had the White House lit up with floodlights.
I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude.
On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned following news of his involvement in the Watergate scandal. It was an abrupt ending for Pat Nixon.
She was deeply saddened and very distressed. She believed that Watergate was simply a political firestorm, that it was going to subside.
A lot of what she learned about Watergate occurred in the very last days when transcripts were released.
After the White House, Pat Nixon wasn't well. She had a fairly serious stroke. Later on, she was diagnosed with lung cancer.
Pat Nixon died at her New Jersey home on June 22, 1993. She was 81 years old.